Why did she say these things? What is Keir Starmer going to do now? That's the topic of this video. I've got a few clips coming up, including a really juicy one at the end, so stay tuned for that. Couple of pieces of background information that you might need to make sense of this. Diane Abbott sent a letter to a national newspaper, got in some very hot water for suggesting that some groups, Jewish and Irish travellers, don't experience racism. As a result, she's lost what's called the whip. The whip is a weird concept in UK politics. Whips are basically members of political parties that make sure that other members of that party toe the party line. Diane Abbott was responsible for making sure that Labour MPs were voting in accordance with what the Labour Party wanted. So it's quite a high-ranking position. Obviously, she's now lost that, and no one is quite sure what Keir Starmer is going to do with her now in the aftermath of her comments. So the first clip that we've got is from this morning with Philip Schofield and Holly Willoughby.
Right, before all of that, all this week we're talking about the Labour Party launching a new initiative to tackle violence against women and girls. We're joined now by the leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer. Good morning.
Good morning.
I can't imagine, it's a very important week. You're launching a campaign outlining your commitment to tackling violence against women, and then over the weekend you have a major distraction with Diane Abbott.
Yes, obviously that is regrettable on every level. What she said is to be thoroughly condemned. It was anti-Semitic, and it's very important that we acted quickly. But, you know, this is the week when we are talking about violence against women and girls and what we would want to do if we're privileged enough to come into government to tackle violence against women and girls.
She has issued a statement saying that she wished to wholly and unreservedly withdraw her remarks and disassociate herself from them. She added that the errors arose in an initial draft being sent. There is no excuse and I wish to apologise for any anguish caused. When you acted very quickly, actually, and this is something that I know that you've been very focused on when you came into the party, and she has been suspended, but there is a call to go further than that, that she should be expelled from the party. I imagine this is something you've been considering.
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the first things I said when I became leader of the Labour Party just over 3 years ago is that we would tear out anti-Semitism by its roots. And I meant what I said. And that's why, as soon as we saw what had been written by Diane Abbott, we had to take action. And I'm glad we took swift action. What now happens is there's a process, there's an investigation, obviously. Diane will say whatever she wants to say in response to that. And then there'll have to be an outcome, so we'll have to wait for that. But it was very important to me that we acted very, very quickly and made it clear that the Labour Party has changed and we will not tolerate that sort of language, that sort of statement, because it was anti-Semitic.
This was a major issue under Jeremy Corbyn. As you said, you were going to rip it out when you arrived, and here it is, you know, sort of face forward. So is there still an anti-Semitic problem within the party?
Well, obviously, what Diane Abbott said was anti-Semitic, so that's why we took the action that we did. We have done a lot in the last 3 years. I will admit that the fight against anti-Semitism is never over in any organisation, any political party, any society. I don't think anybody believes that you get to a point where you don't need to concern yourself anymore. What I asked of Jewish communities when I started as leader of the party was the space to show that I meant what I said. And they allowed me that space. And I think if you were to ask them, they would say we've made significant progress on this, and that the Labour Party now is unrecognisable from the Labour Party of 2019. But for that very reason, it was really important for me to act as quickly as we did on Sunday morning.
Is it frustrating for you that things like this come up and it pulls focus from the job in hand?
Yes, of course it is, because we've got local elections coming up. The stuff that we're doing on violence against women and girls is really important.
Yeah.
It's work I've been involved in for, 10, 15 years now. It matters to me as a person as well as to the Labour Party and I hope a Labour government. And I want that discussion to be had about what we do to combat violence against women and girls. 1 in 3 women and girls are subject to, abuse, harassment of some sort. It's a huge, huge issue. And we need to do much more. And what I'm trying to do this week is not just to say, I don't think the government's done a very good job, I don't, but to say, well, what would you do then? What would an incoming Labour government do? I've worked on this when I was Director of Public Prosecutions and...
Before we look at Keir Starmer, I do want to mention a few things that I see Holly doing. When we cut to this wider shot, we see her adjust in her seat. She brings her hand up to cover her mouth. She tucks her hair behind her ear. She interlaces her fingers. And I think her lips purse a little bit as well. These behaviours independently I would probably overlook, but there's quite a little cluster of stuff going on there, and they're all quite uncomfortable gestures. We've got lip pursing, if that's there, lacing the fingers. I associate that with needing reassurance and pacifying. Lots of skin-on-skin contact going on. Obviously, there's hushing and mouth blocking is usually to do with withholding opinions or thinking you're getting away with something. Grooming gestures, tucking your hair behind the ear. Taken all together, it kind of feels like she's a bit uncomfortable with the topic of conversation. I don't think that she likes what Diane Abbott has said at all. She has quite a calm, collected demeanour that she's obviously going to go through with the interview, but I don't think she likes it one bit. Looking at Keir's body language, we see that he's got his leg crossed over, and I would say it's important that Philip and Holly are to his right, because he's got his left leg crossed over his right leg, but he has both his hands down by his right hip, and there's a slight twist in his spine as he's looking at Holly and Philip. And try this posture out yourself. It's really uncomfortable. I think being that uncomfortable is reflecting an uncomfortable dynamic inside his head, and I don't think he likes what he knows is going to come up. As we'll see, he has quite a prepared statement and a separate topic that he really wants to discuss. So Philip opens the questioning, but actually he doesn't ask a question. If you notice, he just says a statement, and as he's asking the statement, we see that Keir is nodding along and his blink rate goes up a little bit, and when we get a nice slow blink. Now I think that's either blocking, he either doesn't want to look at Philip, who's the source of this uncomfortableness, or his brain is whirring and moving at quite a click and it's slowing down the rate of the blink. I'm hedging on the second, because when Philip finishes talking, there's this big pause before Keir starts talking again. And I think the pause could be because it's not technically a question and he was kind of expecting the lilt at the end to reference a question, but because of this slow blink as well, I think he's thinking of the answer, thinking about how he wants to come up with an answer to that question. So we get this big pause, and then regrettable at every level and condemn, and we get some sort of emphasis on those two things, which I think is a bit of a weird turn of phrase. He doesn't say it's wrong or immoral, he says it's regrettable, and we regret things that don't have outcomes that we want, which suggests that actually he doesn't mind the action, it's just the outcome, which I thought was weird. Condemning is also a social sort of action. It's about displaying to society that you're on the same page and that you're with everybody else. So it just seems like an odd turn of phrase to me to be using, and at every level, suggesting that there's multiple levels that this might be okay on one level and not on another level. I think that's a bit odd. It makes me wonder who he thinks this is regrettable for. Is he regretting this for her, for Diane, or is he regretting this for the Labour Party because it's put them in a bit of hot water? I'm not sure. You'll have to let me know what you think. But as he goes through his answer, which is essentially just, we acted quickly, that's basically all he says. We get a tongue jut on quickly, or just after the word quickly. I think it's not a lip lick. I just did. I do think it's a tongue jut because of how far it comes out, and we'll see him lick his lips later on, and it doesn't come so far out, so there's definitely some distaste or uncomfortable nature there. So he's kind of going through his answer about how fast he acted, and he shifts, he moves his body position and boxes, what I would call a box gesture, to talk about violence against women, which is what he really wants to talk about, and most of the interview is actually about that. So that's a really interesting way of pulling people's attention to something and displaying the thing that you want them to focus on. It's a really nice piece of body language. If it's choreographed or not, I'm not sure. And then he uses his right hand to kind of gesture about a timeline, kind of moving forwards like this. As we'll see, he tends to associate positive things with his right hand and with right hand space, and negative things with his left. This is something called gestural hemispheric tendency. Although we might not always use the one side of space for negative things or for positive things, most people do have a preference that comes out over time, and we'll see that a little bit later on for him. And then throughout this whole clip, what you're going to see is that not only do his eyes drift down and to his left, which Greg Hartley calls internal dialogue, so he's thinking about the words and what he's going to say. His whole head will drop down. And in this instance, he's actually talking to Philip and Holly, who are on his right, and then his whole head dives down quickly and comes back up. And I think he says this on the word prejudice. And I think because of the connotation of that word in the context of racism, I think he might actually be thinking, oh gosh, I shouldn't have used that word. I should have used something else. So as Holly is asking her question, which again is not actually a question, it's a statement, but he doesn't pause for as long on this one, which I think is an interesting contrast between the first two questions. We get a few things. We get a lip retraction, when the lips go in past the teeth. We get a slight lip purse, I think, when the lips come back out, which is usually withholding opinion or disagreement. And then we get a swallow as well. And that's just, I think, in the first half of Holly talking. So he's definitely uncomfortable about this question, definitely doesn't really want to talk about it very much. It goes up to a wide shot and we see his hands are still over by his right hand side, which is a bit weird. His hands are down and his thumbs are quite flat. We use thumbs to broadcast confidence in lots of different situations. If someone has their arms crossed and their thumbs are up, that's a lot more confident than thumbs in. If someone has their hands on hips, you can look at the thumbs there as well. And later on we'll see him steeple and bowing, but with thumbs up when he gets a bit more confident. It goes back to a close shot. We get another lip retraction. So even before the question or the statement has really finished, pretty clear that he's on the ropes with this one. He's very uncomfortable and doesn't really want to answer, as indeed he doesn't. He tries to jump in when she talks about how fast he responded. We get this
acted very quickly, actually, and this is something that
I think he wanted to cut the question short and talk more about that, because that's all he really says about the topic is how fast they acted, and we see that in the later clip as well. We see him shift over to his other side again, and just before Holly stops talking and he starts answering, we get this intake of breath, this
is something
which I think is him preparing to answer the question. He's getting more oxygen in because his brain is absolutely hammering it right now. So the actual answer is pretty hilarious. He qualifies with like, yeah, so what you need to understand, something like that. We get a resume statement when he became the leader of the second largest political party in the UK. He never really answers the question, so it's a non-answer statement as well. His eyebrows kind of come up, but they stay up, and he's locked eyes, and he's requesting approval is what I would call this. Again, this is what Greg Harley would call this, but he's talking like, do you believe me? Please, we're on the same page here, aren't we? And I think Holly's kind of aware of this, because when the camera cuts to her, obviously we have to be careful with when cameras cut between people. We're never quite sure that one event follows the next, if that makes sense. But she's got this sour taste in the mouth, so she's not really interested in this answer either. We get a lick on investigation, but it doesn't come as far out as the tongue jut does earlier, if you notice. So this is a sign of stress. This is a sign of grooming behaviors as well. This whole question is a lot faster than he was at the start, so he's really trying to get through this, and he doesn't really have a lot to say other than we're going to have to wait for the investigation to finish, and it's not up to me. Philip then comes out and asks whether or not the Labour Party still has a problem with anti-Semitism, which is, I think, right at the heart of what many people are asking. And what's interesting is that Keir Starmer's right hand, which is the hand and the space he associates with positive information, retreats and goes all the way back, and now he starts using his left hand a lot more. What I think is interesting is we get this postural bump. He gets a lot energized by the idea of the fight against anti-Semitism never being over. And I think this is because if the fight is never over, and you find an instance of anti-Semitism, then it's not his fault, because it's always going to be there. If the fight was over, like if they'd cleared it all out and then this had happened, then the question is, well, you said that it was all gone and clearly that was a lie, or clearly you failed. There's no implication of failure if the fight is always there. And you get a slight loss of fluency in there. He starts a sentence and then kind of doesn't figure out how to end it, and then ends it on concerned and goes into a separate point. Again, he's down in internal dialogue quite a lot, which makes me think that he's either remembering things that other people have said, or he's making up arguments on the fly. And that's what I think he does with this idea of asking Jewish peoples or Jewish communities. Chase Hughes, who's a body language and behavioral expert in the US, has this great idea that if you want to know what somebody really thinks, ask them what they think everybody else thinks. And I think this is just another example of that. He's pulling other people into the question and saying this is what they would say, whereas really I think this is what he thinks. He might well have talked to Jewish communities or Jewish leaders, so maybe he is remembering what they told him. I think he's made this argument up on the fly. I think it could have came to him and he's just getting it out there. And then finally, Holly gives him an out. She allows him to transition the interview into what he wants to talk about, which is the violence against women. And what's interesting is that he is barriering on his front leg. He's got both hands around there, which is definitely barriering, but his thumbs are now pointing straight up. So he's definitely still a little unsure, but this is encouraging to him. And he comes up with, yes, of course it is, which is a little bit faster, a little bit higher in pitch. So he's definitely energized by this, and because he sees that he's moving in the right direction. He's still a little bit unsure because he comes out with this line of, I hope it's important for a Labour government, which is a little bit weird. He hopes that violence against women is important to a Labour government. He doesn't know that. Hopefully he's actually saying that he hopes that there is a Labour government coming soon rather than hoping that it's important. That would be a lot better. And then the main reason that I kept this part in, because it's not about Diane Abbott, is this wonderful demonstration of gestural hemispheric tendency. And he's talking about what the government has done. It's his left hand and it's way out. It's all the way as far as he can get away from him. And then when he's talking about what a Labour government would do, it comes all the way back and is pretty much dead in front of him, but it's slightly to the right. So bad government all the way over here, his government good right here. Fascinating stuff. So summing up that clip, I think it's pretty obvious that Keir Starmer is pretty uncomfortable with this topic. He doesn't quite know how to answer these questions, and his main strategy is the speed with which he acted. He definitely had a topic that he wanted to talk about and feels that this whole Diane Abbott thing is kind of just distracting everybody. This next clip is from The Guardian. It's from some public appearance that Keir Starmer has made. You can't see the interviewers, but they're clearly asking him questions. It's a little cut up, but that's not on my end.
In my view, what she said was to be condemned. It was anti-Semitic. It's absolutely right that we acted as swiftly as we did. That's the change that you've seen in the Labour Party. But do I condemn what she said? I absolutely condemn what she said. Do I want to show the Labour Party takes this seriously and acts very quickly? Yes, I do, and that's why we acted as swiftly as we did yesterday. There's an investigation going on at the moment. That's the right thing. The whip has been suspended. That was done very swiftly, and I have condemned what she said. Along with many other people, we should be talking about the cost of living today. There are many people today who can't afford the basic food they need or their energy bills. That's what we should be talking about. So, of course, I'm disappointed that we're talking about anti-Semitism.
So the first thing that jumps out at me is he's using his left hand, which from the previous clip we think is probably associated with negative events, and it's in this rather strange position. He does use this hand position in the first clip. If you saw that, let me know in the comments. But his fingers are all close together and the thumb is pressing quite hard into the fingers. To me, that seems like he's pacifying or regaining some control over the environment, and it's a little bit like he's quietening down the topic of conversation. He's saying, don't listen, don't talk so loudly about that. And his gestures are kind of like this. I think this is something he's been trained to do, because he also does it with his right hand. We know that politicians have been coached over the years to avoid certain gestures. That's why you never really see them pointing with an index finger like this. Research shows that it's quite accusatory. Some politicians gesture with what I call a weapon hand, because this is, if you are holding a weapon, this is how you might do it. So lots of politicians will gesture like that. I think he's been coached to use this as it's a nice neutral kind of hand position, and he does it on both hands. We get this big head movement and an eyebrow flash on condemned. So I think at this point it's clear that the condemning of this is a prepared line. It's a word that everyone has agreed, this is the word we're going to use for it. We're condemning it. The head movement is really big though, and it's much bigger than any of the other head movements that we've seen so far. He is emphasizing with it, but it's almost like he's ducking or turtling or dodging the question almost. So I would call this a head jut. He's not very fond of the question. It's a little bit aggressive. It's kind of moving down and it's acting to protect the throat a little bit and make him a smaller target. I think when he's talking about the change that the Labour Party has gone through, something he'd also talked about in the first clip, I think we see some contempt on the left side of his face. It looks like it's being pulled up a little bit. in a way that it isn't on the right. And contempt is a facial expression or an emotion that denotes superiority in a hierarchy. So I don't think he's feeling contempt for the idea of changing the Labour Party from being anti-Semitic to not being anti-Semitic. I think he's probably feeling superior to the old Labour Party that definitely had a problem with anti-Semitism, but obviously now his doesn't. Again, we see that the main message he's going for is the speed at which the response happened. In fact, when he's saying, this is how fast we acted, we get this nice kind of zooming action with his hand, and it kind of stays over here a little bit, I think, as an effort to say, we've talked about this and we're not going back to talk about it again. He wants to move on. We get one of these nice box gestures again, where he's framing the investigation. Interestingly, that means that he thinks there are some things that are within the purview of the investigation and some things that might be outside the purview of the investigation. So I wonder if at some point in the future, somebody is going to make the argument that whatever happens as a result of the investigation, that's being made on the basis of information that shouldn't be used. Don't know about that one, just an idea. He starts using his right hand, which we associate with positive things for him, I think, when he's talking about the whip being removed, which is, I think, the main sort of thing that he's done so far. So he feels positively about that, and having acted so quickly. We also get an eyebrow flash at that point, so he's really emphasising that that's the important thing that's happened. And then when he moves on to what he wants to talk about here, which is the cost of living crisis, he's in a shop or something, so that's what he's come to talk about. His left hand comes across, and I think barrier is in front of him. Interestingly, in the first clip of Keir Starmer, we also saw him barrier with his left hand. I thought that was because Holly and Philip were on his right, but it seems like he might have a preference for holding his left hand or left arm across his chest to form that barrier. So again, this clip is mainly about him saying, we acted super fast, that's what's important. Of course we condemn it, but the main thing is that we acted fast. Speed is of the essence for him. He's also come here with a prepared sort of argument, something else that he wants to talk about, and quickly tries to push the topic towards that and away from this sensitive area, which I think is probably fair enough for him. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you learnt something, leave a like, leave a comment, and I will see you in the next one.